My son looked me in the eye 3 months before his father's diagnosis and said, "Mom, you've always been the emotional one. The business stuff, that's never really been your thing." I smiled and said nothing. That was the moment I knew something had shifted. Not in Harold. Harold had been my husband for 41 years. He built Whitmore Construction from a 2-truck operation into a regional company worth more than I ever let myself count. He knew exactly who I was. No, something had shifted in my son, in Cade, and in the woman he married 5 years ago, the one who called me Mrs. Whitmore even after I asked her twice to call me Nora. Her name was Alexis. I want to be fair when I talk about her, because I've spent a lot of time in the past year trying to be fair. She wasn't a monster. When Cade first brought her home, she was polished, sharp. She worked in corporate finance, something with mergers and acquisitions, and she had a way of asking questions that sounded like compliments, but landed like small cuts. "You must have been so patient staying home all those years while Harold built everything." That kind of thing. I'd smile. Harold would squeeze my hand under the table. "She's ambitious," Harold told me once, after they left a Sunday dinner early. He was washing dishes, and I was drying, and he said it the way you'd describe weather, not good or bad. Just a condition. "She's calculating," I said. He handed me a wet pan. "Same thing, depending on what she's calculating." We didn't talk about it much after that. Harold wasn't a man who worried in advance. He believed in dealing with things when they arrived. It was one of the qualities I loved most about him, and one of the qualities that, looking back, left a few doors unlocked that should have been bolted shut. Harold was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's in March. The neurologist was kind. He explained what the progression might look like, what it might not look like, and he was careful to say that plenty of people lived full and independent lives for many years. Harold sat straight in that chair and asked 2 practical questions and thanked the doctor by name when we left. In the parking lot, he held my hand for a long time without saying anything. That night, he said, "I want to get things organized." I thought he meant the house. The filing cabinet in the study that we'd been meaning to sort through for years, the stack of folders that had been growing since 2009. I said, "Of course, we can start this weekend." He meant the estate. Over the next few weeks, Harold had quiet conversations with our family attorney, a man named Mr. Prentice, who'd handled our legal work for over 20 years. I knew these conversations were happening. Harold mentioned them the way he mentioned everything, directly, without drama. He told me he was updating the trust documents, that he wanted to make sure everything was structured properly, that Mr. Prentice had some recommendations about how to protect the assets long-term. I trusted Harold completely. 41 years. I trusted him the way you trust the floor under your feet. Not because you think about it, but because it has never once failed you. What I didn't know, what Harold was carefully, deliberately not telling me yet, was what else he was setting in motion. Cade started coming around more after the diagnosis. I want to give him the benefit of the doubt even now. Some of it was genuine. He loved his father. I know that. But Alexis started coming with him almost every time, and she started asking questions I noticed but couldn't quite object to without seeming paranoid. Questions about the business structure, about whether Harold had considered a management transition, about whether certain assets might be better positioned before any change in Harold's capacity. Capacity. That word kept appearing. One evening, Cade sat across from me at the kitchen table while Harold was resting, and he said, "Mom, Alexis and I have been talking. We think it might be a good idea if you let us take on some of the financial management, just to reduce your stress." I looked at my son, who I had driven to baseball practice and stayed up with when he had nightmares, and watched walk across the stage in a cap and gown, and I felt something cold move through me. "I'm not stressed," I said. "You might be, though, when things get harder with Dad. When things get harder with your father," I said. "I'll let you know if I need help." He nodded and looked down at his coffee, and I recognized the look. It was the same look he used to give me at 16, when I said no to something he'd already decided he was going to do anyway. I called Mr. Prentice the next morning. I didn't tell Harold right away. I want to be clear about that, because it might sound like I was going behind his back, and I wasn't, not really. I just needed information. I needed to understand where we actually stood. Mr. Prentice had known us both for decades. He met with me alone in his office, and I told him what Cade had said. I told him about the questions Alexis had been asking. I told him about the word capacity appearing in conversation more than once. Mr. Prentice listened without interrupting. Then he opened the folder on his desk and turned it toward me. Harold had already been there. 2 weeks earlier, the second update to the trust was already done. I stared at the document without fully understanding it at first. Mr. Prentice walked me through it patiently. Harold had structured everything as a revocable living trust. Our home, the business interests, the investment accounts, everything with specific ironclad provisions. The trust would become irrevocable upon certain conditions, including any attempt by a third party to establish guardianship or diminish capacity without documented medical consensus. There was a clause that Mr. Prentice quietly called the protection provision. It meant that if anyone tried to legally maneuver around my role as co-trustee, the attempt itself would trigger a restructuring that moved assets further out of reach. Harold had thought of everything. He had done it quietly, without telling me, because he knew me. He knew I would have wanted to talk about it, to sit with it, to say, do we really think it'll come to that? And Harold didn't want to spend our time on that. He wanted it handled, and then he wanted to come home and have dinner and watch the news and hold my hand on the couch. When I got home that afternoon, Harold was in his chair reading. I stood in the doorway for a moment. You knew, I said. He looked up. I know a lot of things. About Cade, about Alexis. He set down his book. I've been watching her ask questions about things that aren't her questions to ask for about 2 years, he said. I'm sick, Nora. I'm not blind. I sat on the arm of his chair, the way I used to when we were young and the furniture was cheaper and nothing felt precious. He put his arm around my waist. I didn't want you to worry, he said. I'm going to worry anyway. I know, but now you can worry with a net. That was Harold. Practical, even about love. Things moved quickly after that. The way things do when someone is sick and other people start smelling money the way they smell rain before it comes. Alexis suggested a family meeting to discuss Harold's care plan. She sent an actual agenda by email. Point 3 on the agenda was transition of financial oversight. I read it twice and then I printed it and put it in the folder Mr. Prentice had given me because I had started keeping a folder. At the meeting, held at our dining room table, Alexis had brought printed documents. She presented them the way she probably presented things at work, efficiently, with confidence, making it sound like everything was already decided and this was just the formality. The documents proposed giving Cade and Alexis joint power of attorney over the financial accounts. Harold sat at the head of the table and listened without expression. When she finished, he said, "Thank you, Alexis." And then he said nothing else. Cade said, "Dad, we just think it would simplify things, for Mum especially." I said, "I don't find it complicated." Alexis smiled the way she always smiled at me, patient, slightly pitying. "Nora, no one is saying you can't handle it. We're just saying there might come a time when..." "When what?" I asked. "When having extra support in place is wise." "I have support in place," I said. "I have our attorney. I have our financial advisor. I have 41 years of knowing exactly how everything in this family works." There was a silence. Harold reached over and picked up one of the documents Alexis had printed. He looked at it for a moment, then he put it back down and said, "We're not signing anything today." Alexis's smile didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. She folded her hands on the table and said, "Of course, we understand. Take your time." She was already thinking about next steps, I could tell. People like Alexis always have next steps. Over the following months, the pressure came in smaller ways. Cade calling to ask about specific account balances. Alexis emailing about estate planning best practices with articles attached. A suggestion that we meet with a different attorney, someone more current on Elsa law. Small moves. Individually, they seemed like concern. Together, they felt like preparation. Harold's conditions stayed stable, better than the doctors initially projected. He had good days and harder days, but his mind was sharp. He knew what was happening. We talked about it some evenings, not anxiously, but plainly, the way we talked about everything. "How long do you think this goes on?" I asked him one night. "Until she decides to move more directly," he said. "She's been circling. Eventually she'll go for the center." He was right. She did. In January, Cade called and said he needed to talk to me about something important. He came alone, which surprised me. He sat at the same kitchen table, and he looked tired in a way I recognized. Not physically tired, but tired of carrying something. He told me Alexis had contacted a different attorney. He told me this attorney had advised that given Harold's diagnosis, there were grounds to petition for a formal review of his decision-making capacity, that this was a legal avenue families sometimes used for protection. He told me Alexis wanted to move forward. I looked at my son for a long time. "And what do you want?" I asked. He looked at the table. "I don't know, Mom. She keeps saying that if we wait too long, there won't be anything left to protect." "Protect from whom?" I asked him. He didn't answer. "Cade," I said, and I kept my voice steady because I needed him to hear me clearly. "Your father built this family. He built the business. He built the house you grew up in. And he has spent the last 10 months quietly making sure that we are protected, not from strangers, from exactly this." Something moved across my son's face. It took me a moment to name it. It was shame. He left shortly after. He didn't call Alexis from our driveway. I watched from the window to see if he would. He just sat in his car for a few minutes, and then he drove away. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the attorney Alexis had retained. It formally notified me that a petition was being filed to establish a conservatorship over Harold's financial affairs, citing his Parkinson's diagnosis as the basis for concern about his decision-making capacity. I read the letter once. Then I placed it in my folder and I called Mr. Prentice. "It's time," I said. He had been waiting for this call. We had in fact prepared for this call, something Harold had specifically asked Mr. Prentice to be ready for. The trust documents were in order. There was a second layer Harold had added, which Mr. Prentice now explained to me in full, a detailed, notarized letter from Harold's neurologist, obtained months earlier, clearly stating that Harold Whitmore retained full cognitive capacity and decision-making ability, that his diagnosis did not impair his legal competency, and that any claim to the contrary was medically unsupported at this time. Harold had gotten that letter before they even filed. The conservatorship petition was heard by a judge 6 weeks later. Alexis sat at one table with her attorney, composed and professional. Mr. Prentice and I sat at the other. Harold was not required to be there, but he came. He sat beside me in a suit and tie, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had built something real and knew how to protect it. The judge reviewed the petition. Then she reviewed the trust documentation. Then she reviewed the neurologist's letter. Then she looked up. She said, "Counsel, I'm not sure what you expected to find here, but Mr. Whitmore appears to have made very thorough and competent arrangements. The trust structure is sound. The medical documentation is current, and there is no evidentiary basis for this petition." She paused. She looked at Alexis's attorney and said, "This petition is denied. I'd also advise your client to carefully consider whether any future actions in this matter could expose her to liability for bad faith filings." Alexis sat very still. She had walked in that morning looking like someone who was about to win something. I recognized the posture. She did not look that way when we walked out. In the parking lot, Harold took my hand. Cade was not in that courtroom. He had not known the exact date of the hearing. But he called me that evening, and when I told him what had happened, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mom, I'm sorry." I had been waiting for those words for almost a year. I had rehearsed what I might say in return. Something composed, something that set clear boundaries, something that let him know how deeply he had hurt me. But when the moment came, I just said, "I know." And then I said, "Your father loves you very much." "That has never been the question." He cried. My son, who was 40 years old and had not cried in front of me since his 20s, cried on the phone. I let him. We didn't fix everything that night. You don't fix things in one phone call when trust has been broken over the course of a year. But something cracked open, the way ground cracks after a long freeze. There was at least the beginning of air getting in. Alexis and Cade separated 4 months later. I heard this from Cade, not from any satisfaction in saying it. He came to the house on a Saturday and sat with Harold and me, and he told us what had been happening, how Alexis had slowly reframed his thinking about the family money, about his inheritance, about what he was owed after years of working in his father's shadow. He said the word owed with the voice of someone who had only recently heard how ugly it sounded. Harold listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "I never thought of you as someone in my shadow. I thought of you as someone I was trying to give the light to." Cade had to look away at that. Harold's condition has continued to be manageable. We have a good routine. We have the same morning coffee, and the same evening news, and the same couch. Sometimes his hands are steadier than others. Some days are better than others. But he is here, and he is Harold, and nothing, no attorney, no petition, no carefully printed agenda, touched what we built together. The last time I saw Alexis was at a neighbour's gathering, about 2 months after the separation. She was there with mutual friends who didn't know the full story. She saw me from across the room. I watched her make a quick mental calculation, and then she smiled and said, "Nora, it's been a while," I said. "It has." There was a pause, the kind that sits on top of everything that can't be said in a room full of people. She said, "I hope Harold is well." "He is," I said. "He's very well." And then I turned to speak to someone else. I didn't need to say anything more. I didn't need her to understand what her plan had cost her. The marriage, the access, the future she had mapped out. I didn't need her to apologize or explain or crumble. Some things carry their own weight. You don't have to add to them. There's something I want to say to anyone watching this who recognizes something in this story, who has felt themselves being slowly edged out of their own life, their own family, their own history. The quietest thing I did in all of this was make a phone call the morning after my son told me I couldn't handle the business stuff. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't make accusations. I just picked up the phone and made sure I understood exactly where I stood. That phone call changed everything, not because it started a fight, because it ended the possibility of one. Harold always said, the best defense is preparation, not reaction. After 41 years, I finally understood exactly what he meant. I've thought a lot about what made Alexis so certain she would win. She was intelligent. She was prepared. She understood financial structures and legal language better than most people I've met. And she had spent years, patiently and methodically, building a case. In her mind, I think she genuinely believed that patience and strategy were enough. That if you planned carefully and moved quietly, the outcome was yours to decide. What she didn't understand, what I'm not sure she's capable of understanding, is that Harold had been doing the same thing. Only Harold wasn't building a case against anyone. He was building a shelter. There's a difference, and that difference is everything. Greed has a particular blindness to it, not stupidity. Alexis was never stupid. But greed narrows your vision down to one thing, what you want and how to get it. It makes you see other people as either useful or irrelevant. It made her look at me and see an obstacle. An older woman, emotional, not business-minded, easy to maneuver around. She calculated every angle except the one that mattered most, which was that Harold knew exactly who he had married 41 years ago, and he trusted that person completely. That trust, the real kind, the kind built slowly over decades of small, honest moments, is not something you can file a petition against. You cannot send it a letter from an attorney. You cannot restructure it or reposition it or declare it a liability. What I learned from this whole year is something I wish I had understood more clearly when I was younger. Preparation is not the same as fear. Harold didn't prepare because he was afraid of Cade, or even of Alexis. He prepared because he was clear-eyed about human nature, and he loved me too much to leave anything to chance. That's not cynicism, that's wisdom. And wisdom, unlike cleverness, tends to hold up in a courtroom. I also learned something about my son that I didn't want to face. Cade is a good person who made a serious mistake. He let someone else's ambitions slowly replace his own judgment. He stopped asking what was right and started asking what was available. Those are two very different questions, and they lead to two very different lives. I've watched him, in the months since, working his way back to the person I raised. It's slow, it's honest. I respect it more than I would respect a quick apology. The hardest part of this whole story, for me, isn't Alexis. It's knowing that my son sat across from me at my own kitchen table and considered, even briefly, whether his father's illness was an opportunity. That's the thing I've had to sit with. Not with anger. I moved through the anger. But with something quieter, a kind of grief for the version of him I thought I knew without condition. But I also believe that people can find their way back to themselves. Cade is proof of that, and I think the most valuable thing I could do, more than winning in court, more than being right, was to still be here when he did. Harold is still here too. Some mornings are harder than others. But he had his coffee this morning and he made a joke about the weather and he held my hand on the way back inside. That is what we protected. Not the trust documents. Not the $84 million. This. The ordinary, irreplaceable weight of a life built together. Nobody can petition their way into that, and nobody can take it.